To start things off, astrology is defined as a range of divinatory practices recognized as pseudoscientific since the 18th century that propose that information about human affairs and terrestrial events may be discerned by studying the apparent positions of celestial objects. Typically, when viewing things such as astrology, or things such as tarot cards, as found with Charles Williams, the application of archetypes is adopted. Archetypes typically based on mythological figures, such as the Greek and Roman gods. The items that appear are not just the object itself, but rather a subject that is associated with its own personal traits. The reason why all of this is relevant is the fact that men like Michael Ward, an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, and professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University, promotes the idea that C.S. Lewis based his Narnia books on the 7 planets of medieval astrology, with his claims not without ample evidence to support his theory. All one needs to do is to read the chapter The Heavens in Lewis's scholarly book The Discarded Image, or even read Lewis's poem The Planets, in order to see that Jack was more than familiar and obsessed with Western medieval astrology. The 7 planets of medieval astrology are to represent the gods and goddesses of antiquity, and the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia repeat themes and patterns based on the personalities of these false deities which Lewis has meticulously described. Lewis teases the idea that a story could have a hidden message like this in the background of a series, an idea that he referred to as the Kappa element in romance, which is the title of an essay that Lewis wrote, which later became a chapter in his compiled works titled On Stories. In this essay, he writes, "To be stories at all, they must be a series of events, but it must be understood that this series, the plot, as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or quality." The following part of this presentation will briefly define how these elements play along throughout the narrative of the Narnia books, where afterward we will be examining why this is not something that Christians should get excited about. This examination will not only be looking at what Lewis said in his poem, The Planets, nor just what he had to say in The Discarded Image, and neither just the outline Ward provides in his lectures, but we will also be looking at what the book, The Mythic Tarot, has to say in relation to the themes tied to the gods and goddesses that would be inspiring Lewis. As Lewis directly says, they are planets as well as gods. The incorporation of tarot cards in this analysis is appropriate, seeing that Lewis could have easily learned about this hidden knowledge from that of his friend, Charles Williams, as we examined in the previous chapter. This will not be done to endorse tarot, but just to show that all of these things are connected. Let's move on to our first comparison. To start, the magician's nephew is tied to Venus, which is the equivalent to the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Lewis writes in Discarded Image that Venus stands second only to Jupiter, her metal is copper, and she produces beauty and amorousness. The notable feature of Venus's parts in the poem reads that she bewitches the worlds and describes her scepter as wide-spreading, similarly to the White Witch's scepter, as this is the book that she is introduced in. However, Venus has more to do with spring, as the grass growing, the grain bursting, and the flower unfolding brings up images of new beginnings that are found within the season. Since this is the first book in the series, and the creation of Narnia unfolds within this story, we can see this being the birth of this other world, which is tied to the themes of creation and fertility Venus is associated with. In the mythic tarot, the Lovers is associated with three goddesses, Hera, Aphrodite, and Athene, which we will use in relation to Aphrodite. This card's meaning is tied with the first of life's greatest challenges to the developing individual, the problem of choice in love. This dilemma is not only about trying to decide between two women or two men, it also reflects our values because our choices mirror back to us the kind of person we wish to become. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is associated with Jupiter, or Jove, otherwise known as Zeus. Lewis describes Jove as jovial and kingly, while also being cheerful, festive yet temperate, tranquil and magnanimous. In the poem, it says, "Of wrath ended and woes mended, of winter past and guilt forgiven," which describes the end of the winter reign of the White Witch and the forgiveness of Edmund to a fault. The poem goes on to call Jove lion-hearted, as this book has Aslan having more of an active involvement in the story than many others within the series. You can see, even with the essential plot point of the Pevensies becoming kings and queens of Narnia, monarchical authority is present throughout the narrative, as this is the installment that best represents Jupiter. Jupiter, or Zeus, is associated with the tarot known as the Emperor. It is described to represent the father who embodies our spiritual ideas, our ethical codes, the self-sufficiency which we survive in the world, the authority and ambition that drives us to achieve, and the discipline and foresight necessary to accomplish our goals. The horse and his boy is tied to Mercury, otherwise known as Hermes in Greek mythology. Lewis says that Mercury produces quicksilver and says that this represents the beneficent men of action according to Dante Alighieri. Lewis also associates Mercury to skilled eagerness or bright alacrity. Lewis starts off this section of the poem by saying Mercury marches, madcap rover, which can allude to great speed. The poem also calls Mercury the Lord of Language, which can demonstrate the cunningness the character Shasta must demonstrate when improvising to conceal his identity, as he is mistaken for Prince Corin. It is interesting how in Chapter 4, when describing the Calorman soldier who kidnaps Shasta, says about the appearance that instead of turbans they wore steel or silver caps, some of them with jewels, and one with little wings on each side, which is an obvious description of the messenger god Hermes according to Greek mythology. The tarot that is directly in line with Hermes is the Magician, which says somewhere within us, no matter how lost or confused we might be at any point in life, there is something within which has foresight and resources which are often hidden from consciousness, but which can divine what direction to take and what choices to make. Prince Caspian is directly linked with Mars, or Ares for the Greeks. Lewis describes this archetype as having a martial temperament, sturdy hardiness, and calls it a bad planet that causes wars. Mars is also tied to the creation of iron. The story of Prince Caspian has the most battle sequences in it by far, and the Telmarine's military are very much reliant on their use of iron weapons and armor to fight against the Narnians. The end of the story, in chapter 14, has a gladiator fight between Peter and King Miraz, which falls in line with the poem's Hired Gladiator of Good and Evil. The tarot card that is connected with Mars is the Chariot, which is described as the aggressive instincts guided and directed by the will of consciousness, and full of vitality yet unwilling to work in harmony. The voyage of the Dawn Treader is linked to Sol, the sun god, which could either be Helios or Apollo. As described in Discarded Image, Lewis asserts that Sol produces the noblest metal, gold, and is described as making men wise and liberal, and is the heaven of theologians and philosophers. Whether it is Aslan separating the light from his mane in his country, the water that turns everything into gold, or the fact that they end their voyage in the land where the rising sun meets the east, you can see how this is directly tied to C.S. Lewis's astrological views of the sun. It is self-evident that the tarot that matches with Sol is the card, the sun. This card personifies something greater than one individual's capacity to gain knowledge and insight. The desire for insight can be found with Caspian's desire to find the lost lords that served his father, which is why he embarked on his quest. The silver chair is associated with Luna, or the moon, which is similar to the goddess Hecate. Discarded Image describes Luna as being a descent from better to worse, such as necessity to contingency, or incorruptible to corruptible, and so forth. Her metal being silver, and whose persona is tied to that of insanity. Obviously, the silver chair does not only play on the silver the moon is associated with, but themes of water, such as the marsh where Puddleglum dwells, and of themes of insanity, as Prince Rilian is tied to the silver chair during his lapses into madness. The moon card is tied with an image of the mysterious watery depths of the unconscious, and then later says, an experience of the great collective sea of the unconscious from which not only the individual but the whole life has emerged. Finally, the last battle is connected with Saturn, or Kronos. Lewis writes in Discarded Image that Saturn is connected with sickness and old age, and points to the depiction of Father Time with a scythe as the embodiment of this idea. He is also tied with fatal accidents, pestilences, treacheries, and what Lewis refers to as bad luck. At the end of the story, Father Time even makes an appearance as the stars fall from the sky. The story also has many treacheries, with Shift deceiving the Narnians into believing that Puzzle is Aslan, not to mention all the death that takes place in the story. It is only fitting for Lewis that the end of his Narnia series would be associated with this type of figure. The card within the major arcana that is tied to Kronos is the Hermit, which is described as the last of the 4 moral lessons which the fool must learn. The lesson of time and the limitations of mortal life. After all that we have examined, it is important to understand what the scriptures have to say about these gods Lewis is referencing and why this is so wrong. As the Bible points out in Deuteronomy 32 verse 17, they sacrificed unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not.